Hey, good Wednesday morning, everybody. BAMWX.com meteorologist Brett Waltz here, giving you a weather yield update, guys. A lot to talk about today. My first weather yield, so super excited to be doing that. We're going to talk about La Nina. La Nina is a big deal in the overall pattern as we move forward, and I want to keep an eye on a potential delay of the development of La Nina. Over the past couple of weeks, those cooler oceanic waters have really stopped cooling down. If anything, they've actually gotten a little bit warmer. We've just seen a stall in that transition from an El Nino to a La Nina, and I do think that it will have some impacts on the pattern as we go over the next couple of months and even into the month of fall. So if we take a look here at what we're going to talk about today, I want to start out actually by reviewing the impacts of Beryl, still causing problems today across parts of the Ohio Valley with some gusty winds and rain. There were tornadoes yesterday across parts of the Ohio Valley associated with Beryl, along with heavy rain. Going to look at where we're at summer to date, and I want to talk about some major week 2 data discrepancies. There are some big differences right now between the American data, the European data, the Canadian data, and I want to talk about why they're so different and hopefully help you all and allow you to react to where things actually end up verifying. You know, where exactly is the rain going to be? Where could it be a little bit drier? It's these situations where these types of analyses can hopefully really help you all out. We'll talk about August outlooks, that La Nina delay, and then what the La Nina delay could mean in terms of yields. Let's start out though with Hurricane Beryl. It has been ongoing since June 28th, so it has been a long-lived system. It developed well off to the east, well north of South America. Category 5 storm made landfall in Texas and currently still residing over the Ohio Valley as it continues to bring those remnants through and some of that rain, along with some gusty winds, 40 to 50 mile an hour gusts across parts of the northern Ohio Valley possible today. Looking at some of the records that Beryl set, I think that it goes without saying that this storm is likely going to be retired in terms of the name. There probably won't be another Hurricane Beryl. It was the furthest east a hurricane has ever formed in June on record. It was the largest rapid intensification in June, strongest June hurricane on record, strongest July hurricane on record, earliest Category 4 and Category 5 storm. You can go on and on here. It was also the earliest hurricane landfall in Texas since 1986. Just a very memorable, impactful system for this early in the year. Could be a precursor, I think, to what could come later on in the season as we work towards peak climatology in August and September. Again, Beryl's still causing some impacts. As it continues to progress further off to the east, it will allow for some more severe weather potential across the northeastern United States today. Some wind, maybe a couple of isolated tornadoes. That will be possible. But once we get the impacts of Beryl out after the next day or two, the pattern overall isn't that active. Now, there's going to be some rain and some storm cluster threats that we're going to need to keep an eye on across parts of the upper Midwest, northern plains, and into the Ohio Valley later this weekend into early next week. But it's not necessarily widespread, broad brushed heavy rainfall chances in here. Can there be some storm clusters? Can some people cash in on moisture? Yes, but it's not insanely wet as we go into early next week. In fact, much of the central plains, southern plains, down through the deep south, pretty dry in here as we go through this time frame, through the 16th of the month or so. And so a drier stretch in here as Beryl kind of pulls the core of the moisture away, kind of zaps the atmosphere, if you will. Now, the impacts of that won't necessarily last for an extended period of time, but central southern plains down to the deep south, looking at a drier stretch as we go through this time frame. It's cooler to start too, but it will heat up a little bit as we work into this weekend. And so we'll be losing a little bit of moisture there as we go into the weekend and early next week with some hotter and drier conditions. In terms of rainfall the past 7 days, guys, the Ohio Valley and into Missouri has just been absolutely drenched the past 7 days. Anywhere you see kind of those yellow colors indicate 2.25 inches plus of rain. The purple colors indicate more than 5 inches of rain, a widespread area across central Missouri, into parts of central Illinois, much of Indiana here cashing in on some heavy rain as well. Really the spots that have kind of been skipped over the past 7 days, and we talked about this, that be not quite as active across some of these areas that were excessively wet over the past 7 days. It's just been a little bit drier. Some spots have missed out, couple of pockets in Kansas, couple of pockets in eastern Iowa, northern Illinois, but for the most part, for the primary growing regions, it has continued to be very active the past 7 days. And this is only through 12 a.m. More rain has fallen here across Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan that will be added to this in tomorrow's update. In terms of the past 14 days, again, not including the past 24 hours here yet, again, the vast majority are wetter than normal. There's been a couple of pockets in here that have been a bit drier. And again, this area that I'm circling right now in northern Indiana, northern Illinois, that'll fill in a little bit. But take a look at some of the excessive rainfall that's happened. Widespread areas across Iowa, eastern Nebraska, northeastern Kansas, Missouri, Illinois. This area in here, 2 to 6 inches wetter than normal over the past 14 days. And so there just has not been a lack of moisture. The vast majority have continued to cash in. And if we look at how things have averaged out just summer to date, we see this corridor here, and there's a lot of corn in here. There's a lot of corn in this region. Top 5 wettest on record for southern Minnesota, southeastern South Dakota, parts of northern Iowa, much of Wisconsin. And the areas that have been drier so far summer to date, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, these are areas that are cashing in the short term and getting some moisture, and over the past 7 days have been a lot wetter. And so even the areas where there were some concerns coming into early July have been able to see really more rain than they saw the entire month of June through the first 10 days of July for the most part. In terms of soil moisture, again, you can see the area that there was some concern across southern Indiana and Ohio here into parts of Kentucky. The Mid-Atlantic's still dry. That's an area to keep an eye on further off to the east, but this is an area that has seen some moisture and will likely continue to have some opportunities moving ahead. Elsewhere, a little bit drier in Kansas, but again, I still think in the extended range there are going to be some moisture opportunities in there. And aside from that, most areas are wetter than normal in terms of soil moisture right now. Taking a look at the 2-week change, nothing super notable here. It's gotten a little drier across the Northwest Plains. In fact, some of those areas probably needed to dry out a little bit, given some of the excessive rains that fell in June. Wouldn't say anything super notable there. In terms of just overall the next 7 days, here's a look at rainfall totals. This kind of combines some of Beryl's rains today. Some of that maybe has already fallen. Again, drier down to the south and to the west, kind of further away from Beryl's influence. But we will need to watch for some storm cluster threats trying to pick up a little bit more as we work into early next week across parts of the Midwest. In terms of the percent of normal rainfall, and I know Michael talked about this last week, week 2 last week, we were kind of favoring it to be maybe a little bit drier. And you can certainly see this is a drier stretch in here across parts of the plains and down through the southern tier of the U.S. Again, Beryl influence and some moisture opportunities continuing, though, across parts of the upper Midwest. Now, with that in mind, I want to talk about the week 2 time frame, and this is an extremely challenging forecast right now because there are major differences, and it's really been consistently big differences in this week 2 time frame. That's going to be the 17th to the 23rd. If we take a look here, EPS is the top left. It's drier north, would be a little bit drier across especially the northern Corn Belt, and it's very wet down to the south. The GEFS generally here, you can kind of see, wetter to the north and to the east, and it's drier south. Very, very different, almost the opposite. The Canadian, it's wetter west and drier east. Another different solution. And the GFS would just suggest that we've got messy flow and it's have or have nots everywhere. There's not really a consistent pattern. And that just begs the question, okay, which of these is right? When you have such stout differences, how do we go about figuring out the forecast here? And so what I wanted to do is I looked at the upper level setup on the EPS because I feel like it's been the most consistently wet south. It's been very consistent with that idea, though it has rolled forward a little bit drier in the short term. I think that is something to keep in mind. The next 7 days are a little bit drier than what the EPS had this time last week, especially down to the south. So it's maybe had a little bit of a bias to be too wet too far south, and I think there's a reason for that. We take a look, it's trying to put in this stationary front, and there is a front, there's no doubt about it, that's going to actually bring some cooler air in for a time in the week 2 time frame, which we'll talk about that here in a little bit, but it stalls the front out, which allows for moisture in this area that I've circled to sustain pretty consistently throughout the entire time frame. Now, The issue is the EPS has a bias at times to hold these fronts too far south. A lot of times it tries to bring these fronts in and it lingers them too long. What that can lead to are risks that maybe it's too wet too far south. The GEFS, the GEPS, more progressive with the front, it moves it out and you get back into some of that northwest flow type of pattern, that messy look that we talked about. The other thing that I've noticed with time is this high pressure, this Bermuda high and some heat on the East Coast has tended to intensify as we've gotten closer. And so even if we did stall out the stationary boundary, I think the risk would be that it comes further to the north. And so I just think the EPS right now, given its bias to kind of hang on to these fronts too long, given the warmer trends on the East Coast, it's probably just too wet too far south. Now, because there is a front, I am skeptical of the GEFS being so wet across the northern tier of the Ag Belt. I'm favoring more of an in-between solution. I think that just makes the most sense right now. There's a front in there. There's likely going to be some northwest messy flow at times. And I think much of the Central Plains and Ohio Valley can ultimately average out wetter than normal. The risk that I see is if that front trends stronger, and obviously if the EPS does pick up at stalling out more correctly, I would say it's probably a drier risk through here and a wetter risk across the southern tier of the United States. So that is at least something to watch because we're getting into a critical time frame with pollination. The risk is a drier north central U.S. and a wetter southern plains. Now, even if it does turn drier, I'm very skeptical that it's bone dry and there's no rain. I still think that there's messy chances in there. But I do think that at least that is a risk worth watching. The EPS is drier than normal. We're going a little bit wetter than its forecast for the Corn Belt, but it is a critical time frame. And so I really think the next 3 or 4 days is going to be an extremely important time frame to watch model trends as we go through the middle part of July. Now, in terms of temperatures here, guys, the next 7 days, this is important to note too, the EPS has had a cooler bias as of late. It's widespread warmer than normal for much of the country. It's not notable across the Ag Belt, a couple of degrees above normal. The core of the heat continues to be situated on the West Coast and on the East Coast. And to be honest, guys, looking at the upper level setup, I don't see a major difference through this week 2 time frame. I think the core of the heat is west. There's probably periods of heat on the East Coast. There's certainly a cold front in here where we're going to get some more seasonable to cooler days across the eastern Ag Belt. But I also think that there are warmer stretches as well, and the majority of the country is warmer than normal. And I think we continue to kind of see that pattern even into the weeks 3 and 4 time frame. I think it's a warmer than normal pattern for the U.S. as a whole. At times, heat can bleed east into the Ag Belt, but the more consistent heat is kind of in those coastal areas. In terms of precipitation, as we go through the end of July and into early August, with warmth west, you get northwest flow like this at times. With warmth east at times, you get some of this Gulf moisture. I think that we continue to see a more active pattern. Similar to week 2, I think the risk is just wetter in here and drier in here. Everything shifted a little bit further down to the south. I think that's the risk to watch as we go through the end of July. Now, with all that being said, what are we looking like beyond that? I think the slower La Nina is really having a big impact on the pattern. Michael talked about it last week in terms of the failing to materialize heat wave that we had kind of talked about. The global winds favored a big heat wave. The Southern Oscillation Index favored a big heat wave. The North Pacific signal favored a big heat wave, but it has failed to materialize. And I think that it's because, in part, to this slower La Nina transition. Initially, a lot of data was taking us into a stronger or moderate La Nina by summer, and I would say the latest signals keep us neutral at least until September, October, November, and this EPS here really keeps it neutral all the way into winter. Now, it does have a tendency to be too warm with La Nina sometimes, but I think that even with our multi-model average here, you're not looking at a strong La Nina, maybe a weak La Nina by fall. Perhaps. It could even be a little bit later than that. That's important because you look at a year like 2005 was very, very similar to that. It did not develop the La Nina until late in fall and into winter. And July did have some dry time across the north central part of the country with moisture more down to the south. Temperature is also very similar to what we're seeing right now. And so again, that's maybe a little bit of a drier risk to the forecast that we need to keep an eye on late July across the north versus our forecast. I still think it can be a little bit wetter than this, but this is, again, a risk to watch across the north central part of the country. Taking a look at the July forecast update on our analogs here, very similar to what we talked about. Warmer than normal on the coast, little bit warmer than normal to more seasonable in between, and then a lot of wetness in there. And again, these analogs I think maybe showed a little bit better than just 05 on its own. Much of the primary growing areas I think can be wetter than normal as we go throughout this month of July. Probably more drier risk the further west you go, out into the mountain west to the west coast. Now, with all that being said, let's talk about August real quick, and we'll kind of wrap things up. August here, guys, with more tropical activity likely increasing, whether it's August 1st or August 10th, I'm not 100% sure, but I do think that the tropics are going to get more active again. It's going to tend to favor more heat across the eastern part of the country. You can also see kind of the storm track through here from the Gulf of Mexico, wetter than normal across the southeastern tier of the United States. When you get a lot of tropical activity, it can lead to some drier risk across Nebraska and Iowa. You can still get some moisture here to the north. And again, maybe it's not bone dry, but I could see the risk that the growing season could end a little bit drier in August in parts of Iowa and Nebraska. We look at our August forecast here, haven't really had any changes. I think it's hotter than normal. And looking at precip, again, I think parts of Nebraska, South Dakota, Kansas, Iowa, because of tropical activity, could end on a little bit of a drier note. Now, with all of this in mind, looking at those years that were delayed with La Nina or more neutral through summer, 2020, 2016, 2005, 2003, pretty much all of them are above trend line. The only one that's not is 2020, and it's right below trend line. Overall, these analogs support an above trend line yield for corn, and same thing for soybeans. There's one outlier here, 2003. I would kind of factor that out. The other three are a good bit above trend line as a whole, and even the average is still above trend line in terms of soybeans. And so, again, we need to watch maybe some of those risks late July, but even so, even if there's a slightly drier trend, like we mentioned here, across the northwestern plains, I still don't see it as a pattern that cuts off moisture. I don't see a huge weather concern right now for the Corn Belt. I think overall conditions are looking pretty favorable, and I think that there's plenty of moisture opportunities to help out as we move forward. Could there be a couple more drier stretches in there than what we saw in June? That's possible. But I don't see enough of that type of an influence to indicate that we're going to suddenly fall into below normal yields and have major weather concerns for the markets. And so just something to take away, something to keep in mind. We'll watch the risk, we'll watch the forecast ahead, but overall those analogs and those yield analogs there supporting an above trendline yield and a fairly favorable weather pattern ahead. Guys, that's all I have for today's episode of Weather Yield. Guys, be sure to go and like our YouTube channel. It's just at BAMWXCom. And if you're interested in getting more of these analyses on a daily basis, scan that QR code, inquire. You can also look at the type of weather information that we put out on our Clarity platform there for more detailed information for your specific location. Thanks, guys. Have a great Wednesday.